know, one of my favorite things to incorporate in my work is freeform sculpting. Now, I don't mean sculpting in terms of taking a big block of wood and making a person's face out of it. I don't really know how to do that. But I'm talking about structural sculpting, which means curves and seat hollows and, you know, interesting things like this spiral here. Being able to say, just because I don't have a guide or I don't have a bearing or I don't have a router bit that big, those limitations are no longer an issue if you know how to use some of these tools to attain those goals. Okay, so that's really my goal here today, is to show you some of the tools that I use for these processes, how they work, and how you might be able to incorporate them into your work. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the tools. Now, the most powerful wood hog I have here is my die grinder. It's outfitted with an Arbortech blade, which has 3 huge teeth on it. Now, these teeth are rounded so that you can approach the wood vertically or nearly horizontally. And you'll see as we use it, there's certain ways, certain angles that you go that take a bigger bite or less of a bite. But the bottom line is you don't want to dig in too far too fast, because this thing will walk on you if you're not careful. So exercise extreme caution with this tool. The other thing is a die grinder. This one is electric. You could put in different size mills, different profiles, all types of cutting tools in the end. Essentially, it's like a handheld exposed router bit. But you use this very carefully to carve in details, and you could use a big ball mill like this to do things like roundovers and coves. Okay. Now let's say you've used this to hog out the bulk of the material. You use the Arbortech blade. It's a very rough surface afterwards, and you need to smooth that out. So the rough smoothing happens with a polisher. Now the polisher is outfitted with a flexible pad here. Okay, and on the outside of that pad, I've got a sanding disc. So this, you're sort of just, you know, feathering things in and just smoothing out curves. It works great for that and removes a lot of material in a hurry. And you can finish up with a random orbit sander at that point. The other thing that I like to use are card scrapers. I've got a gooseneck scraper and a standard square scraper and a cabinet maker's rasp. A lot of times these tools are just too aggressive and you need to get in there with a hand tool for the ultimate in control. And a Nicholson's rasp is the way to get there. Now, the first example I want to show you is this zebra wood setting bench that I made a few years ago. There are 2 curves that we need to create here, one from top to bottom and then one that goes along this orientation here. Now, the top to bottom curve, you could cut that on the bandsaw, and I would if my bandsaw blade wasn't incredibly dull right now. I've got one on order, so I can't. But this curve, you would probably have to do that using the method that I'm going to show you. So just for the sake of a learning experience, I'm going to take this blank and we're going to start by carving out the long curve. And the same principle applies to the one that goes across from side to side. So let's fire up the tools and jump right in. Now, this process is going to be loud and messy. This Arbortech blade can seriously kick up some wood chips. So that means full face protection. I like to use this face shield that I usually use when I'm turning. And of course, ear protection. And you got to protect your lungs. After a couple of minutes of sanding, we're left with a pretty smooth and even curve here. You'll probably work it a little bit more, but that's pretty darn close. Now, this is a very large serving tray. It's actually like an ottoman tray that I made a couple of years ago. And it was a good opportunity for me to practice making coves, roundovers, things like that by hand. Now, in this case, there certainly are router bits that could have handled the job, but I really wanted to take the time to practice it, because making a cove over this long distance is pretty challenging to make sure that it's nice and consistent from one end to the other. But in the process of doing that, I ironed out a few techniques and things that I think make it almost foolproof and very easy to do, so that if you are in a situation where your router bits just aren't big enough and you need to make a really big cove or a profile that just is something you can't find in a normal router bit, you can do it by hand. So let me show you how it's done. right, after a little sanding, that cove is looking pretty sweet. Now this is just a really small example, but you could see how you might be able to take those techniques and tools and apply them to hundreds of other things in your woodworking. And really that's the ultimate goal here. The bench example was just a very simple curve, but when you really start to think about what you might be able to do with that in terms of chair seats and complex curves that go in multiple directions, you can start to really see the power that we've unleashed by reminding ourselves that we don't always need a guide or an edge guide or a straight edge. We could just sort of go by pencil lines, and if we have complete control and safe control over our tools, we just really opened up our toolbox and expanded the possibilities for what we can build and what we can imagine up in our brains and bring to life in wood. So I am hot and sweaty and covered with sawdust, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's time for me to shower.